We'll hand it over to Craig Regelbrugge for the American Horticultural Update.
Hey folks, pretty intimidating to follow such a handsome and well-spoken individual as Christian Dellis, but I will try to do my best. I need to be allowed to screen share.
You should be good to go. I just made you co-host.
Yep, looking better now. Beautiful. Okay. I, for one, am sorry we can't be face-to-face. I will tell you folks that we had the good fortune to be able to bring our industry together for the first time face-to-face in Columbus a couple weeks ago for Cultivate 21, what I like to refer to as 8,000 of my closest friends. And things went without a hitch. We kind of hit that little dip where Ohio had just reopened, and the latest variant had not yet made the progress that it seems to be making these days. So it was a great event. Let's see. I wanted to start by just sort of reminding everybody of the team we've got, the boots on the ground working in the advocacy and research space. To my right, Tal Coley, our Director of Government Affairs based here in Washington, D.C., Jennifer Gray up in Columbus, who is our Research Programs Administrator and All Things Horticultural Research Institute. And then the newest addition to our staff, we hired a gentleman with a horticulture PhD named Michael Martin. He is a South Carolinian working and living in Georgia, and actually did a stint, among other things, in the plant industry department at Clemson. So he's worn the hat of a regulator, at least in a limited capacity for a limited amount of time. I joined our staff a few weeks ago. We're thrilled to have him on board. So I'm sure many of you will get to work with him as well as I in the days and weeks ahead. Wanted just to make a couple of comments looking back in the rearview mirror at what we've just been through and what it's meant for our industry. I mean, obviously we're not completely out of the pandemic, but when the pandemic really began to bear down in a serious way in March of 2020, and the national emergency was declared and so forth, it was kind of an all hell breaking loose situation for our industry, and we feared the worst, in that we were on the cusp of spring. It was already spring in the warmer climates and soon to be spring just about everywhere else. And in the early days, the disruptions associated with the pandemic, depending on what you were growing and who you were selling through, the impacts were anywhere from relatively minor to absolutely severe. But fortunately, as I think you probably all have some sense of, by the time we got through April into May, and Congress stepped in with the CARES Act, and USDA ultimately launched the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. We worked hard to make sure that our industry had the ability to be eligible. We're ultimately successful at that. But by the time we got into the later spring and summer, and in the places where there had been greater business disruptions, even there, places like Pennsylvania and Michigan, things began to open up. Ultimately, the industry had a very, very strong year, and the phenomenon that played out for most people in just about everywhere was that consumers stuck at home decided to invest in their homes and landscapes, and we actually saw a lot of first-time buyers, millennials, coming into the industry and purchasing products and beginning to experience horticulture. So it's been a generational shift in the consumer base that we've been anticipating and hoping for a long time. It took a pandemic, but as with all things, occasionally a silver lining. In terms of industry issues, I'm not going to talk about most of these because they're really not so relevant to what we do together, but there are two things that have really dominated people's attention as the pandemic really began to bear down and are still big problems. One of them being labor. The labor issues are only worse than they've been, and then the other being logistics. Really, really severe problems. Sourcing trucks and the expense of truck transportation went through the roof, particularly this spring, made worse by the big freeze that obviously affected a large swath of the middle part of the country from Texas up. and disrupted supply chains, disrupted fuel distribution, disrupted the orderly movement of all things moved by trucks. And so it's been, and frankly, all spring long, we really never completely recovered. Obviously, a lot of other issues in play, a lot of concerns about a lot of interest around infrastructure, but a lot of concerns around how we're going to pay for that. So tax policy questions. And then, of course, we have some plant health issues. Per usual, we have some plant health issues, and I'll just touch on a couple today. And we'll try to keep an eyeball on the chat if anybody wants to pose a question in the chat while my time is still with us. I do want to say, even in the plant health space, progress in a pandemic, kind of not something to necessarily assume or presume, but we actually made some really good progress and fought some difficult battles in some cases on plant health related issues that we find ourselves working on together during the course of the run of the pandemic. So I'll just touch on and say a few words about a couple of them. I think, first of all, on a very, very positive note, the offshore greenhouse certification program went live during the pandemic. It had been piloted for a couple of years. The first season's pilot had been, frankly, plagued is too strong a word, but affected negatively by some data gathering and other related inconsistencies. And so the pilot ran an additional year to be sure that the program was serving up on its intended purpose of taking a pretty low risk supply chain, that being imported vegetative cuttings, mostly of annuals, some perennial plants coming from predominantly Latin American countries up to the United States. Already a fairly low risk pathway, but the OGCP features a systems approach that looks at all the important things with respect to how a facility is constructed and maintained, sanitation, pest management, record keeping, and so forth. So that program went fully live this past season, and compliant shipments coming in that program have basically become eligible for inspection at a lower frequency than plant consignments that are not coming in through the program. So very, very excited. And I want to give a shout out to Carolyn Cruz. She's been hands on the wheel with this program in recent, for a number of months now. And she's been just highly energetic and highly motivated. And we've been thrilled to work with her on that. Pelargonium, a little bit more on the challenge side. We obviously managed a Ralstonia outbreak during the pandemic, and per usual, learned a lot from it. Don't want to do it again anytime soon, either the pandemic or the Ralstonia outbreak. But just want to acknowledge all the hard work at all levels. And fortunately, in this case, the commercial company that was involved and their offshore farm, despite a breach that occurred somehow, they were extremely cooperative and have really worked to address the concerns and move forward. So ultimately, it fits in the success column, even though none of us would have wished it on our competitor, quite frankly. So let alone good friends. One thing I did want to mention on Pelargonium, and we're in conversations with APHIS on this. APHIS has an interest in deploying some of their molecular diagnostic technologies within the plant inspection stations at the ports of arrival. There are many logistical complications associated with doing that in a way that is least disruptive to the trade. So the conversations continue on how to get that fine-tuned. APHIS is keenly interested in doing it. We're keenly interested in avoiding downside consequences, and hopefully we can manage to achieve both those objectives. We also saw the implementation of the so-called single window automated commercial environment, with respect to shipments that are regulated by APHIS, obviously plants for planting included. The implementation date had been delayed a number of times in recent years, but ultimately was scheduled for the latter part of January of this year. And as you might imagine, that is the absolute peak season for young plant shipments coming into this country, particularly on rooted cuttings. of which we are now importing, I believe, in excess of 2 billion that are an important part of our industry's supply chain. And as you can imagine, kind of perishable, pretty highly perishable. So we were extremely afraid of what we might end up learning the hard way in the middle of this peak. And fortunately, APHIS heard our pleas and did a soft launch where the message set, was implemented, but the full consequences, were deferred until March. And it did allow for some troubleshooting and cleaning up our processes, particularly with some of the companies that play a major brokerage role, like UPS. UPS had not completely worked through all the details that they had to, and so ultimately the soft launch was helpful. We are still dealing with some ongoing concerns in some of the plant inspection stations, particularly as relates to scheduling weekend overtime inspections and so forth. There's again an active conversation going on with APHIS on that front, and a special shout out to Andy Huberty, who's been, I think we're turning her hair gray, frankly. And so we appreciate all her efforts to help facilitate those conversations. Also, I wanted just to flag, I think I have a message out to Sarika. We'll be connecting soon, but I believe that we are at the final implementation deadline for operations that are grandfathered under the U.S.-Canada Greenhouse Certification Program to be onboarded into the revised program. I think the implementation date is in September, so that's something that we're going to be paying attention to and beating the bushes to make sure that everybody who's not through that process is aware of that. The SANC program was officially fully launched during the pandemic. For what that's worth, we haven't actually seen a huge amount of interest. There are a couple of operations, for example, 2 in Arizona that immediately come to mind that are highly motivated and working through the process. But I'll talk a bit more about what might be next for SANC in a moment. And then finally, also pandemic successes. We National Plant Board conducted a review of the Japanese beetle harmonization program, which we of course participated in, and shout out to Charles from North Dakota for running a low drama process on Japanese beetle harmonization review. So again, another success. I want to talk a bit about what's next on SANC. First of all, we are still working on the risk assessment tool that's in the process of a handoff from some early developmental work that the National Plant Board led. We've got a really, really excellent team of technology experts that are working through an evolution of that tool into an environment that will be, I think, stable and will facilitate its administration in the future. There's also been a significant effort to take it to the next level in terms of its user friendliness, its usability. We are on the cusp. I would imagine within the next couple of weeks, we will have the refined risk assessment tool available for beta testing among interested operations in the industry. I've got several on a short list. I'm maintaining a spreadsheet of folks that want to beta test this, but I wanted to make sure that all of the state partners who might have an interested operation are aware that the beta testing opportunities could be coming up. We want to kick the tires of the tool and really make sure that it's ready to live up to its potential. So before it's permanently housed and made more publicly available. Beyond that, we're having within the SANC governing board conversations around growth opportunities and possibilities. And I wanted to spend a couple of moments talking about some of the sort of logical expansion from the original pilot operations that have been certified under SANC. One of those obviously would be subsidiaries of operations that are in. Some of that's already happened. For example, the Greenleaf Nursery Company, the flagship operation being in Oklahoma, the North Carolina operation was onboarded into SANC. The Texas operation, I don't know that we're quite finished, but we're on the verge of finishing onboarding the Texas operation. But some of the other operations that are in the program or may want to come into the program have sister facilities or subsidiary facilities, in some cases in the state where the main location is, and in other cases in other states. And so obviously for these operations, it may be from an internal management consistency perspective a good thing. I think we've got other low-hanging fruit out there, something that the trail's grown a little cold on, but I saw we've got some of our friends in Oregon on the call. So want to just mention, for example, some of the operations that you have in the grower assisted inspection program, which shares a lot of common roots to the SANC program, might be logical points for expansion. And also other supply chain companies, like, for example, Star Roses and Plants in Pennsylvania was one of the first two operations that were certified in the pilot. But a company like Star has a number of folks who are growing young plants, young roses, for example, that feed into Star's production. And John Roush at Star Roses and Plants in Pennsylvania has indicated his strong desire to sort of drive adoption of SANC through their supply chain, frankly, as a risk management tool for them as well as for their suppliers. Two other things we're thinking about, and these conversations are happening in the context of a sort of business development plan that we're working on as a SANC governing board right now. One of them is trying to drive interest in SANC as a novel way of doing business, and we think a better way of doing business, driving interest in the retail marketplace. Many of you may have noticed earlier in the year, Walmart came out with a sustainability announcement. This is not the first nor the only by any stretch, but Walmart indicated that, particularly starting on the produce side, but also getting into live goods, they were going to be requiring participation in sustainability certification programs and so forth. And I think it only makes sense, you know, and we could have this conversation around box tree moth, but it only makes sense for, you know, given the growing role of mass retail in plant distribution, it only makes sense to embrace risk mitigation from a plant health standpoint, and SANC's an opportunity for that. And then there are several formalized sustainability certification programs that are gaining traction in our industry. One of them is a program called MPS. I'm in an active conversation with MPS about whether or not there is a natural linkage where they would recognize some of these systems approach based quality management type of phytosanitary plant health programs as contributing to sustainability and you know, giving, frankly, growers another reason to consider becoming certified under SANC, for instance. Final point I'll make, I know there've been a lot of conversations around what SANC is and is not, and some of this has grown out of, I think, some of the conversations that happen in the aftermath of outbreaks of plant pests like Phytophthora ramorum. Just want to be clear with folks, where we see SANC is really as an elite program that, not elitist, but elite program that the best in the business are going to want to aspire to because they're marketplace leaders. What SANC is not, and wasn't ever really intended to be, is a remedial program, so that when you're trying to bring a nursery that's had an outbreak of a quarantine pest back into compliance, you know, the idea of, well, maybe SANC's for them might logically come up, but I think in reality, that to us, that's very much outside the context of what SANC exists to do versus what other kinds of programs exist to do. Just my 2 cents on that subject. Want to jump over and just make a couple of brief comments on box tree moth. This is a pest that we feel like we've been watching come at us in slow motion, and we've been attempting to proactively prepare for it. So, for example, we've already got some research projects that were funded through Plant Protection Act Section 7721, for example, that are well underway, including foreign cooperators in places where they can do some work that we can't necessarily do as easily here in the United States. So we've been trying to get ahead of the curve and get some tools in the toolbox, including potentially mating disruption or sterile insect technique as a way to deal with this pest. Unfortunately, the detection of the pest in the Toronto area in 2018 came faster than we had hoped, and much faster than we had hoped. The incursion in a shipping nursery and the resulting emergency program. I don't need to share with you the metrics around where that emergency program stands. Many of you are living the dream, but I just really want to underscore that from an industry standpoint, boxwood is an iconic and extremely economically important landscape plant in a large swath of the United States and parts of Canada. Several $100 million at farm gate in production value every year. We're very, very concerned about this pest piling on, particularly in terms of landscape damage on top of the crisis we've just been through in the boxwood space on boxwood blight. I probably created an international incident with our Canadian friends fairly recently when I wrote a rather strongly worded article expressing rather profound disappointment with the fact that all of a sudden we've found this in the nursery system in Canada, at least in Ontario, or at least in the Niagara Peninsula, hopefully on a limited basis. But it's an extreme threat. We view it as an extreme threat. And now we understand it's basically a natural spread across the border threat as well. So we fully support what's going on with the emergency response program. If nothing else, we are hoping to buy as much time as possible, again, to get that toolkit in place with solutions. But we ultimately are very, very disappointed that we're finding ourselves facing the specter faster than we had hoped. I did want to mention, and I apologize for the conflict, but the Horticultural Research Institute's hosting a box tree moth webinar. It's an industry-facing webinar, but we've got APHIS, and we've invited Annie Self to join us to give a state perspective as well, followed by reports from all of the researchers who are actively funded in the space. That will be very preliminary, but we think it's helpful for people in the industry to understand what the research community is looking at, both in terms of understanding life cycle and so forth, as well as, again, filling the toolkit for pest response, pest management. We're going to have an American giving a European perspective, if we're allowed to do that. Bennett Saunders at Saunders Brothers in Virginia has spent a lot of time in Europe looking at what this pest is doing over there and is duly informed accordingly. And then also we're granting an opportunity for a Canadian colleague to talk about the situation up there. So this is coming up on Thursday. It overlaps your closed door meeting. I apologize for the overlap, but it will be recorded and we will make it available to folks on demand. So thanks to everybody who is working with us and joining us on that. And I think with approximately 49 seconds to spare and a moderator smiling just below me, if there are not any questions, and I'm not seeing any right off,
That is correct, Craig. This is Susan Ellenbeck with Missouri Department of Agriculture. I'm helping to co-host today, and so far, the only question that has just come up is how do we find registration information on the HRI website?
That's a great, yes, it's hriresearch.org, and I'll post that in the chat as soon as I'm done talking so that I don't fail at multitasking. But yes, hriresearch.org. And if you've got staff that want to jump on it, we're totally fine. This is an open webinar. It's industry facing, but it's a wide open webinar. And the final point I'll leave you with, if anybody needs cucumbers or zucchini or tomatoes, I have such an abundance in my garden. The blueberry harvest, which you see here, has already ended. I have an entire chest freezer full of blueberries. So if the pandemic continues and food gets short, David Giannino knows where to go in the northern neck of Virginia. Thanks, everyone.